Hi, this is Matt Ingram with a quick video on troubleshooting spatial weights matrices by hand. Um, the example that I'll be using to illustrate this exercise is the example that we've covered in class from Steve Mester and his colleagues from Justice Quarterly in 2013, and we'll be working in GeoDes and Notepad. So what do we mean by troubleshooting spatial weights matrices by hand? If we take a look at GeoDes and load the shapefile from Messner et al., we're looking at a geography of approximately 400 units within Germany. If we build a spatial weights matrix, based on a simple Queen 1 contiguity, we can do that in GeoDes by going to the Tools menu, selecting the weights, and creating that. We'll need to add a new ID variable. We'll call that polyID, and then we can create the Queen 1 contiguity structure very simply, very quickly using the dial button here and specifying Queen 1, the first order contiguity in the window. So we can create that. I've already created it, so you see it already appears here in my working directory. I'll just replace it and say yes, and then close out of here. And we can now make sure we've selected that one, and here it is. So now we've selected it and set as our default. So what might be the problem? Here we can see that if we do a simple ELIZA cluster map, say of the raw robbery rates from the Messner et al. Piece, that's RR57A. If we generate the cluster map, GeoDes alerts us to the fact that we have one neighborless unit. You see it identified here in the top left portion of the map where the legend is, and you can also see it identified in dark gray in the map itself. We can click on the legend color. We see that the unit, the relevant unit, is illuminated in both the cluster map and in the themeless map. So this is our unit that GeoDes is telling us does not have any neighbors. That is, it's not connected to any other units, when it should be connected to at least this unit that we'll highlight now. So there should be a tie, there should be a connection between these two units, and there isn't. So how might we fix that? We've already addressed one way of fixing that in class. You could go into another environment in R or Python and generate the spatial weights, the required spatial weights matrix there, and then double check it. But here, since there's just a single unit, you could also fix this by hand. So the first thing we want to do is identify which unit this is and which unit should be its neighbor. And then we want to go into the spatial weights file itself and fix that by hand. Might be helpful to look at the spatial weights file itself and see what we're talking about. So if I open the working directory, sorry, I'm just going to open here the Queen 1 contiguity weights file. So this is our weights file, the one that we've just created. And if you right click on that and open it with Notepad, what we see here is essentially a neighbor list, or what's called a neighbor list. And the top row simply identifies your data. You've got 413 units in the map10 shapefile, and the unit ID is polyID. What follows thereafter is the ID number of the unit, followed by the number of neighbors it has, and then the identification number of the neighbors. So here in this first line, we see that unit number 1 has one neighbor, and that one neighbor's identification number is 12. Similarly, unit number 2 has two neighbors, and the ID numbers for those two neighbors are 11 and 10. and so on. Unit 3 has 4 neighbors, and these are the ID numbers for the 4 neighbors. So what we want to do is go back to the map and identify the identification numbers for these 2 units, and make sure that we tell the neighbor list that this unit has this unit as its neighbor, and conversely the illuminated unit now has the dark gray unit as its neighbor. Another way you could check this just visually is if we go to the neighborless unit and right click on it, you can go to the 4th option down where it says add neighbors to selection. You can see that nothing is added, whereas if you go to the neighbor that should be connected and you right click on that neighbor and click on add neighbors, you can see that its 4 or 5 neighbors are readily identified. So this dark gray unit should be appearing as one of its neighbors, and conversely this unit just southwest of the dark gray unit should be appearing as the dark gray unit's neighbor. So how can we figure out which are the ID numbers for these units? Well, if we go to the main toolbar menu or tool menu from GeoDes, and we open the table, you can either open that under the pull down menu for table, or you can simply go to the icon for open table, and we can quickly search for the selected unit. There it is. So the illuminated unit is unit 362, and conversely the one that should be its neighbor is unit 358. So we want to make sure that there's a connection between 358 and 362, and that connection is symmetric. So let's go back to the weights file here and find unit 358 first. I'm just scrolling all the way down until we find unit 358. I've passed it now. So here is unit 358, and the original Queen 1 file identified 5 neighbors. We want to add a 6th neighbor, so we want to change this 5 to a 6 and then add 362 up front here as its neighbor. So now unit 358 has 6 neighbors, and these are the 6 ID numbers for its neighbors. And then if we go down here, we see that the GAL file identified 0 neighbors for unit 362. We want to correct that and make sure that unit 362 has 1 neighbor, and that the identification number for that unit is 358. So we've just fixed the weights file by hand. Let's save this under a different name. So we could save this as Queen 1 fix, which I've already done previously, or I'm just going to replace it as Queen 1 fix and save that to yes, replace, and let's close out of here and close this, and let's redo this analysis selecting a new spatial weights. So let's go back to GeoDes, select weights, pick our new file. There's Queen 1 fix. Open it, make sure it's picked as our default. Okay, and let's redo the ELISA analysis with the raw robbery rates. There we are. And here we see now that there are no neighborless units. Up in the legend, you see that there are no more neighborless units. If we go to what was our previously neighborless unit and highlight it, now let's see if it adds our neighbors. It recognizes 358 as its neighbor, excuse me. And now let's see if 358 also recognizes 352. Again, I'm just highlighting 358, right click and go to the 4th option down, and now it recognizes 362. So this is a very simple illustration of how you can troubleshoot a spatial weights matrix by hand. If in your exploratory analysis and you're doing some diagnostics and just playing with the data and you realize that there's a small mistake in your spatial weights matrix, You have several options at your disposal. You could go into R, for instance, and generate the same spatial weights file. You could go into Python and generate the same spatial weights file. Or if you felt so inclined, you could simply fix it by hand by opening the GAL file in Notepad, adjusting the neighbors list, and saving it under a new name or replacing the old file and working from there. Thank you.